How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good, man. Got to the gym this morning. Feeling good. I love the weather in New York right now. It's like, when's the last time you remember sleeping with the window open in the middle of in like the beginning of July? It's pretty wild.
Yeah, never.
I don't know if it's global cooling or what, but I'm here for it. Cool. So today I think we want to talk about SPAs with React 19.
Yeah. And just to set the stage a little, I think for the last, I don't know, 9 months, the last year, we have been talking a lot on this podcast about server components. And we both love server components. They're awesome. Um, I think we're kind of in a spot where we see ourselves using server components, hopefully for the foreseeable future. Um, And part of the one of the big features in React 19 is server components. Server components are one of the core features of 19. And today we're not going to talk about server components. We're going to talk about React SPA apps, so things that do client-side rendering with SPAs. And we kind of want to address this question, if you have an app that you work on and maybe you started it years ago before server components were even on the roadmap, you might be looking at React 19 and thinking this isn't for me. This is not for me. I'm going to be stuck on React 18. But that's not the case. There are a ton of features in React 19 that will totally improve your SPA. And that's what we want to talk about today. So it's going to be React 19 without a server. Let's start with an app that doesn't even do SSR. It's literally, it downloads an HTML file that includes a script tag, and everything is client rendered. I don't know. Do you want to kick us off? Do you want to start?
Yeah, that was a great introduction. And I like that constraint because that's like that pure SPA. That's a good place to start. So let's talk about what a pure SPA looks like in React 18 today.
Yeah.
So, like you said, you're going to ship basically an empty index file, and it's going to load your entire client-side app. And once the JavaScript downloads, it's going to render the page, and it's going to use the URL to render some set of React components, some tree. And at this point, you're in client-side land, and React rendering always needs a frame. We've kind of used this expression in the past where when React renders, it needs something to output. And this is kind of right where one of the big things comes in for React 19. So you have this synchronous rendering, and that means anytime you need to do something where a component needs data from an API endpoint, or you need to wait and check authentication against an auth service, or you need to download anything basically async, you have some loading state. And so, when hooks were announced and useEffect came along, useEffect became the primary way to handle this situation. So most apps need data. And so useEffect is a way to trigger a side effect. And so you use effect and you make your fetch call, but that lets the React get past that first render. And you're going to have something like your data is null or is loading or is pending is true. And so you'll be able to render your loading state. But basically this idea of synchronous rendering always needing a frame because we're rendering in the browser in a UI that is interruptible and, async UI, like UIs can't ever block. This is where a lot of this complexity comes in. And we got useEffect, which was a nice way to kind of box off side effects, things like making a fetch call or waiting on an auth check. And that would get the result, trigger a re-render. And so you have multiple renders. But you're always rendering something at the end of the day. And that worked pretty well. And then we have data libraries that were built on top of useEffect, because getting useEffect right in every situation is pretty tricky, but the primitives are there for you to do so. So we have things like useQuery now Tanstat query, React query, and we have SWR and other data fetching solutions that are built on top of useEffect, but they're all wrapped inside of a hook, and the hook returns the state of the data fetch. So it can be like data null is pending true, or is pending or is loading as false, and then now you have data. And so again, you're splitting this up. You still have this UI as a function of state, and it's all local to the component, and that is how everything works. So then we got Suspense, and Suspense added this idea of how can we decouple the loading state of a component from the component itself. So whether you're checking an auth service or you're making a fetch to an API server using useQuery, all of those different hooks, that all of the things that take time, have their own way to signify that they're loading. Maybe they return an is loading Boolean, or they return like auth state, is pending or unknown. They're all coming up with their own abstractions, their own way to represent the fact that they're in like a loading state. And because this is a common thing for components to need, React said, let's see if we can add a primitive for this. And that was Suspense. And that was introduced a couple of years ago. And that was really, I think, the first time that React had this notion of when we do a render attempt, it's actually okay if some of the components aren't ready yet. And they now have a first-class way to signify that via throwing a promise. And that means that the parent, instead of needing a frame to render for the child, they get to decide what the fallback is. And I guess error boundaries work the same way.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I think about this progression, where with pure React, without error boundaries, without Suspense, you always need a frame. You always need to render something. Error boundaries were introduced. Suspense was introduced. And that decoupled the error state and the loading state from components, and kind of introduced this new part of the mental model, the programming model, which is it's okay sometimes if a component can't give you a frame. If they give you a specific error, then the app as a whole can still have a frame, but we've decoupled those two states from the component. Okay, so if you have an SPA today, maybe you're using Suspense for these data fetching hooks. Some of them have experimental support for Suspense. And so you can start to play around with this with things like React Query and SWR, where you enable a Suspense mode. And now when you use your query, instead of having to say if is loading, return a spinner, you just don't have to worry about that because your component will never get past that part where it suspends. And then again, same with the error handling case. So let's say you're in that world today. You have an SPA. You're using those features to load your data. And now the next big part of most apps is data writes, mutations, what the React team is referring to as actions. And how do you handle doing a data mutation in an SPA today? Well, typically you would have a form, and it takes some user input, or a form. It lets you click delete on a to-do. And you attach an event handler to something like onSubmit.
Yeah, I think just jumping right to it, I think most apps are going to have form onSubmit, handle submit. That's going to be some async function, probably sets some state, makes a bunch of fetch requests, or at the end of the day, it's going to be fetch requests. It might use something like useQuery or useMutate to kind of wrap those. But I would expect any React 18 app that I open up to basically always look like that.
Right.
React apps don't always look the same, but that's one area where I think I would expect them to look the same.
Yes. And React makes it really easy to add event handlers. You have form onSubmit, but you also have button on click, or on mouse. People do all sorts of things. But if you squint your eyes, it actually looks very similar to the loading case that we just talked about. You're going to have something like a use mutation hook that will probably come from one of these libraries. You will be able to reference some API endpoint. And what is that hook going to give you back? It's going to give you an is pending state, which could be true or false. And then it might give you the return value of the action that you executed, the mutation. And again, you could do this with useEffect. These libraries are built on top of useEffect. So it's the same idea as before, where when I click a button, I need a frame to render. And then once it settles, I can now I can set state and re-render. So you use mutation, you give the handler to your form on submit, and then is pending flips to true and false. But again, we're back to the same problem, which is React Query Library, or SWR, has their own way of representing whether the thing is pending or not. They have their own way of representing whether the submission was successful or in an error state. And this means that it makes it hard to compose because each time you do a mutation, you're using some custom version of the fact that there's a submission going on, right? And so similar to the loading case, React said, well, what if we can bring this into React as a first-class API? This is something that most apps need to do. It's this idea of sending a mutation to the server and then syncing our client-side state. But you have the same host of problems, which is while that submission's going out, what's happening to the UI, what happens if you cancel or interrupt. And all of those problems got a lot easier to solve with Suspense on the loading side because you have the same thing. If you kick off multiple loads, what do? It's all easier with Suspense. We can talk about that. And that's basically what actions are in React. So now React has this notion of an action. And this goes to transitions that's basically built on top of this transitions API, which we can talk about. But at a high level, actions are a way for SPAs in React to tell React that there is a mutation, a server-side mutation occurring. And now React knows the pending state of it, and it can do all sorts of stuff that these libraries had to do or that you had to do on your own to coordinate the state of your app with what happens next, whether that's another user event or the data comes back in the success state or the data comes back in an error state. So at a high level, that's kind of the big chunk, I think, that React 19 is going to help SPAs with.
Cool. I have two questions. First question for you is, what does it look like to use these actions? So I have a React 18 app, React 17 app. I have form on submit. What does a refactor to actions look like?
Yep. So the refactor is the simplest way to use actions in an SPA is first, instead of using the on submit event, you're going to use the action prop, which is built into React's form element. This is something, again, that's going to come with every React 19 app because it's built into lowercase form. The action prop takes in an async function, and it knows it's submitting a form. So if the first thing you get to remove is event.prevent default, because you don't get the event because it's not an event, it's an action. And other than that, that's the initial refactor. So you go from on submit equals async function to action equals async function. And I think there's actually something really cool here because I realized this when I was playing with this stuff over the last few weeks. When you do form on submit, you make an async action because you want to use a wait, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the event is just like JavaScript fire and forget. It's just setting that you submitted an event. Giving on submit an async function doesn't actually mean anything from the perspective of form or of React. It doesn't care that it gets an on submit function because when the submit event fires, it's just firing it and you're just doing whatever. So you're just using async so that you can write a wait. With action, async actually means something.
Yeah.
The async steps are what's telling React that you're in like a state of submission, and there's all this cool stuff that falls out of it. So I thought that was the first cool little part.
Yeah, it's great. Why do you, on submit, always make it async because I need to await, my 55 fetch requests.
Exactly.
My next question is, okay, what is the benefit? Like, why should I care, and why do I need this? And I kind of like, I want to hear like specifically like what bugs is this going to help me prevent, or like how does this make my app better? What's the benefit?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing that falls out of this is because action actually knows what an async function is, it's going to put your app into a pending state. And so there's this hook called use transition, which gives you an is pending flag. And if you pass your action into a form, you can get the pending state from that hook. Whereas before, if you're using something like React Query or SWR, they might already have a pending flag that they manage. But the cool thing about this is that React knows about this, first of all. So it saves you from having, if you open your app right now and you have code that's like on submit, prevent default, set as pending true, await fetch, method post, set as pending false, which you probably do if you're writing
You've
an
just
SPA.
described every one of my
Yeah.
React apps. Yeah.
Well, then you get to first delete that prevent default like we talked about. Second, you get to delete the set as pending true and set as pending false. Because in the same way that you got to delete the is loading true and false from your use effects, or you didn't have to, the libraries wouldn't have to do it, you get to delete that from your actions, from all of your action handlers. So that's awesome to start. Secondly, even if you didn't mind writing that code, it's probably the case that you have a lot of race conditions with that code. Because if you have code that looks like that, and again, a lot of folks probably do, I know I do in my SPAs, I've got SPAs I use on my phone right now written in React, and they're going to have all sorts of code like that. What happens if you press submit twice, right? Unless you have some logic for aborting or resetting that pending flip, those states are going to start getting tangled up because you're kicking off multiple on submit handlers concurrently. And now you've got to keep all this stuff in your mind for how all of these things work, what happens when one comes back, if it's in an error state, when they all settle. And the last point is that when you're doing all of this yourself, you're probably also using the return value to update some state in the UI to show either the result of something that happened, and sometimes even before it comes back so you can show optimistic UI. And actions make all of this stuff so much easier. So the first step you get to remove those is pendings. The set is pending true and false. And the really cool thing is here is that just by doing that, if you click the button 3 times, React knows that you've kicked off 3 mutations, and it knows that your app is, this particular action of your app is pending. It's in a pending state. And it's not going to have any race conditions anymore. It's going to stay as pending until all 3 of those clicks settle, which alone is just very, very cool. But moreover, your app remains completely responsive throughout this whole time. So let's say you had the case where you were setting as pending true and false, and then you start clicking around the app while it's pending, and maybe you toggle some panels open or closed, or you navigate around. As you can imagine, this gets really hard to manage really quickly. But because of the way transitions work, and we can do a little mini deep dive in those in a second, all of this is pending. All of the future state that's going to be synced with the return value from the actions is all kind of happening in the background, and React is just managing all of it for you. So it just eliminates a ton of code paths and possible states of your app. In the same way that using Suspense eliminates you having to think about all these, whether I have the data or not. I can add tons of components. They can all suspend, and we can have a single parent at the top that renders the loading state. So there's an analogy there to Suspense and loading.
Cool. You briefly mentioned, and that was great, by the way. You briefly mentioned optimistic updates, like React is going to help with optimistic updates. And I guess before in like my React 18 apps, I was always using some data fetching library. So if I want to do optimistic updates, I would use Apollo. I would fetch the data, and then when I submitted the form, I would go into the Apollo cache and basically take the form's values, get them instantly into the Apollo cache, so everything updates. That's the optimistic update, and then kick off the fetch requests. And then when everything settles, or I guess when the fetch requests end, everything updates, and my UI shows everything. So how does React 19 change the optimistic story, and how does React 19 how does that change? How is my code going to change there?
Yeah, so I think the optimistic case that falls out of this whole design is one of the most exciting. So Today, you let's say you have your React 18 app. You either set is pending to true, and then you wait, and then you use the return value to update the state and re-render UI. Or, like you said, you do an optimistic UI where you kick off the action and you update some cache optimistically. And if you're using Apollo, they have a whole method for doing this. If you're using Tan Stack Router, React Router, React Query, they have a method for doing this. The design in React 19 is a little different. Uh, it disconnects the data that is being loaded to display the page with the mutation going out. So what would this look like? Well, let's say a concrete example. So you like a tweet on Twitter, right? That's a great little example of optimistic UI. When you click like on a tweet, it hearts right away because most of the time it's going to work. So in React 18, that would look like you click on submit for that little button. You flip it to true, and then you send the action. And then maybe you revalidate. Once it comes back, if it was successful, you do it. You set it to true, and it's not optimistic anymore. If it was unsuccessful, maybe you show a toast and you flip it back to false. So the part about this that's tough is that you are basically managing a cache. There's like a cached version of whether the tweet is liked or not as soon as the user goes down this code path. And if you think about the tweet right before it, whether that tweet before it is liked or not, what determines that? It's the data that was loaded when you visited the page, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now, whether the tweet is liked or not, it's going through a different path of logic in your app. Because once I like it, I wrote some code that updated that state kind of forcefully to pull off that optimistic UI. Now let's flip over to React 19. What do you do in React 19? Well, you have your form and you have an action, and you pass an async function, and you kick off the API request to like the tweet. There's a new hook called useOptimistic, which we would use to pull off this optimistic UI. And useOptimistic gets used outside of the action. It gets used as part of render. And you pass in the initial state of the liked state of the tweet to useOptimistic. Then you render from that. And what this useOptimistic hook gives you, it gives you the optimistic liked, optimistic is liked, and set optimistic is liked. And now in your action, right before you kick off the post request or the patch request to like the tweet, you can call set optimistic is liked to true. So what this is going to do is your action goes into a submitting state, but the set is optimistic becomes true immediately. So while the app is submitting, you see the liked tweet, and it was instant and it felt just like it did before. Here's the cool part. Once your submission comes back and you reload the data that was used to initially render the page, useOptimistic will basically throw away any calls to set optimistic that you made during the action and just revert back to the new canonical server-side state, which means if your user's liking stuff and entering stuff and submitting stuff, there's this period where your app, again, is in a submitting state and you're kind of surgically updating things to show immediate feedback. But once all of the pending actions settle in your React app, the UI is guaranteed to look exactly the same as if you were to just hit Command R. And so there's no long-lived cache, whether you're using like an Apollo cache or a cache from a library or just some state in your own app. All of that is just constantly being discarded and being basically refreshed from the new initial data that is being revalidated after the end of the action. So it's kind of like when React first came out and talked about how nice the PHP model was, because every time you click a link on a PHP app, you're just throwing everything away and starting over again. And you get rid of a lot of state that way. And we all know like state is kind of the root of all evil in the sense that it just makes apps hard to build. The more states, the more potential states you have, the more paths there are through your app, the more things you haven't accounted for. So this is a really fascinating design. And again, it comes from the fact that when submissions are going out, React now knows that your app is kind of in this like limbo state where the user has done something and my client kind of knows more about what the user's done than the server has. So let's just let him go to town and show whatever. But once the server comes back with the new data, we're going to get rid of all that. It's as if you could just tell your user to force refresh after they click everything. Wouldn't that be easy? Because then you'd only have one way you'd have to describe the UI. Well, now you do. So I think it's a really awesome thing that falls out of this.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned the client knows more, and I think that's one of the awesome things we get to realize that. Okay, so you described form actions, and React is now aware when we're submitting a form. And so when we're submitting a form, and let's just say our form is making some fetch requests to an API server, when we're submitting that form, React's aware of it, and that lets React basically be able to introduce this useOptimistic hook, which lets us tell the client side app, like, okay, the form is submitting, so right now, like the client, the browser has more information than the server does. We don't know if this, we don't that the request is in flight. We don't know if it's going to be written to the server. So right now, like the client is smarter than the server, it knows more. But the beauty, as you pointed out, the beauty of useOptimistic is that once the server does respond and there's no pending actions, then you know that the client and the server should have the equal amount of information, and you can just throw away all that optimistic state. I think probably like the coolest way to think about this is optimistic works like the optimistic Apollo APIs. Like, yeah, it's a lot to hold, but it works fine when everything works. But as soon as like you have an API request fail or like data comes back differently, like you're just in for a world of pain. And it's really nice that in this React 19, since React is aware of all your actions, they can just pick points and say, okay, we know everything is settled. We're just going to throw away all the optimistic stuff. Also, a great test. You should just be able to like play with your app and hit reload, and it should look the same. You're going to lose transient state, but any state you persist should look the same.
No, it's amazing. And it's not just that it should look the same. It's guaranteed to based on the design of this. It's really neat how you can actually, when your app is settled, you could literally comment out use optimistic and your UI would be the same. And this is something I didn't really understand until I was preparing my talk at ReactConf, which is about this whole topic we're talking about, and I'll link in the show notes, is Andrew pointed this out to me, Andrew Clark, is that this property of useOptimistic, and it's actually also true of suspense. Because React has a mechanism for knowing whether a component is loading data, if it's thrown a promise, that puts the whole React app in a suspended state. While it's suspended, React will render fallbacks. But as soon as it's not suspended, which React knows because no render has thrown a promise, the suspense boundaries are ignored. So you could comment them out and re-render the app, and it would be exactly the same. So they are only there. They're like purely additive for this special state of your app when your app is in a loading state. And it's the same with useOptimistic. They only have an effect on the UI when your app is in a pending state, but otherwise they are guaranteed not to affect the outcome, which again gets you back to this original benefit of React in the first place, which is just set state and re-render everything. So there's nothing long-lived. There's a guarantee that it's going to take, there's only one code path to render the UI of a settled app. So very cool stuff. Same with error boundaries. If there's no error, it's as if the error boundaries don't exist. It's a very forgiving programming model, and it's nice because it harkens back to one of the original benefits of just re-render everything every time state changes.
Yeah, describe the state and let React figure out the how to get from A to B or A to C or B to C. You don't have to think about that. You just describe the state, and it's pretty cool that you get to describe what it looks like optimistically, but then once everything's done, that's all forgotten. Forgiving. Very forgiving is a perfect way to describe it. Very cool.
Absolutely.
Are there any other, so we covered actions, Optimistic. Are there any other of the hooks that you want to hit?
So start transition and use transition. So uh, the way that all of this works, the way that React knows your app is in a pending state is because of something called React transitions. And you might have heard us talk about them. You might be familiar with them. Originally, React transitions were added to React probably a couple years ago at this point. And they have a lot of use cases, not just for actions and data mutations and this whole like syncing server state with client state thing, which is really what actions are about. They talked about this in the keynote at React Conf, how there's this coordination problem when you have, a long-lived UI that is reflecting a snapshot of a server state somewhere. It's really like a coordination problem. What do you show when you have the latest snapshot? What do you show if you've taken an action that changes that snapshot and you don't know what the server is? That's what this whole thing can kind of be reduced to. But transitions are actually like they apply to more cases than just this problem. And you might have heard of transitions as about how to make a low priority or non-urgent updates to your UI. And I think one of the first use cases I remember seeing them talked about was, typing typing like a search text into an input field. And let's say that you're doing like a Google search and you start typing, New England, and you type New England and it's starting to fetch the results. And then you hit space and type in Patriots. And so this is nothing about mutations, right? You're making a GET request with like a query parameter. And when you type New England, your app goes to fetch the results, but then you still want to be able to type in Patriots, and you don't want to show the stale results anymore. So transitions were one way to solve this problem, where you can update some state in your app, and if you mark it as a transition, there's a start transition function. If you mark it as a transition, then it happens in the background. Again, low priority or non-urgent. And it can be interrupted. And so if you interrupt a state of your app with something more urgent, in this example, it would be typing is more urgent. I don't want to see the stale results anymore. That whole update is stale. Transitions is what lets you do that. And we've talked before about one way to think about it is like it just starts rendering your app in the background in like another world. And it can do this because of React state. State is what lets us move from time 1 to 2 to 3 and back. So transitions are this general mechanism for just rendering your app in the background if it takes time, either because of the network or because of the CPU. Dan's original talk talked about like the CPU being an actual bottleneck for rendering. And if that background update takes time or is bound, but then it finishes and it's still relevant, it can be committed. So that's what's happening with actions. With actions, the way it actually works under the hood is you call start transition, you pass an async function, and everything that's happening there, including setting state, right? Because you could be setting state for just normal React state in addition to like your fetch calls. It's all happening in the background, and only when it all finishes is it committed to the screen. And so the action prop on forms does this automatically. Any async function you pass into action on form is marked as a transition. But you can also call start transition yourself, and you can pass async functions to it. And you might want to do this for things like timers or animations, or there's even examples of setting state that could trigger a new suspended tree that you would want to put in a transition. So there's this hook called useTransition, which lets you call start transition. You could pass in an async function or a non-async function, and then you get the is pending state from that. So that's one way to get the pending state of any transition. And there's another hook called useFormStatus, which is more tied to the, I guess this is like the form action case. useFormStatus is a way to get the pending status for specifically form actions. And there's a cool use case here where you can make like a pending or a loading button, put it in any form, and it can show whether that form is being submitted. Again, just with you passing in an async function to action. Um, so those are kind of like the reading side hooks. And I think there's a lot to be learned, to be gained for, again, folks who are building SPAs to understand transitions, because I think a lot of the ways that folks are going to be, any async function you call, I think if we look out a couple years from now, a lot of them are going to be using transitions, because whether you're doing a server-side data mutation or a fetch to something, any part, SPAs often have lots of little parts of the screen that update without full page re-renders, without fully blocking the UI. And anytime you want to update little parts of the screen, like hit a button and it reloads a row of a stock table, that should be able to, your app should still work regardless of the state of that thing. So you want React to know that something is happening, and that's basically what transitions are perfect for. So transitions are really like the underpinning primitive of all this stuff. Actions are a subset of transitions. And then the last hook we didn't talk about, it relates back to actions as well, which is useActionState. And this is a hook that lets you use the return value of a submitted action. And this is really nice for things like validation errors. So going back to our example where you have like, on submit, event prevent default, set as pending to true, fire your action or fire your fetch request. Then you look and see, did the fetch request succeed? If so, set some state. If not, set error to be something, and then set pending to false. So if you're using the action prop, instead of having to set state again, because you can kind of think of it like a smell. If I'm setting state as part of an async function, React doesn't know about it, and I'm back in this coordination problem. Instead, you just return it, and the useActionState hook gives you that and basically re-renders your app, just as in the case where it was successful. So yeah, that's another really cool hook, useActionState. I think a lot of forms that use on submit today and have an is pending state and an is error state are going to look like this in the future. Again, even if this is all just client apps, they're going to have forms with an action prop, and the data is going to come back revalidated the same way it was there in the first place, and the error state will be derived from the return value of the action. So you just get to eliminate a lot of state. And again, if you watch my talk, I kind of go through a refactoring example where I show all this.
Cool. On transitions, I think one of the coolest things of transitions has been the fact that if you imagine an app without transitions and you have like a drop down and you start selecting things in that drop down or menu, and it loads some other part. There's some other part of the UI that is going to basically load data based off what you select. Well, as soon as you select something, you call set state. And then you have a component that like gets past that new state you set, and it says, okay, I have to go off and load the data for this. So it just shows a giant loading spinner. So your app is kind of like you're viewing some data, you click something, you see a loading spinner, and then you're back to viewing that data. So basically, like every time you click something, you can think of like a large section of your app becomes unusable because it's just showing a loading spinner. Now, as a React developer, you might be like, yeah, of course, because I set state and I have to now load that data based off state. But transitions let you express that selection of the item as a low priority update so that you can keep the old UI rendered. So you can select an item, show a little, and also too, you get access to the transition state. So like if the transition is pending, you can replace a whole UI with a spinner if you want, or you can just show a little spinner next to the item you selected, whatever you want to do. But you as a developer get full control over that. But again, I think the cool thing is that you can keep the old UI rendered and you can click other things while that transition is running. It kind of reminds me of like how web browsers work. Like I can click a link to an item and it's really slow, and then I can just like click another link. My whole app doesn't immediately go into a loading spinner as soon as I click a link.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think
Great.
that's like, yep.
I'm glad you brought that point up. That's huge. And again, when transitions were first introduced, that's kind of the main, just like the main motivation was a lot of times you want to keep the old app responsive. If you're typing in an input, back to my case where you're typing in Google, the UI should respond immediately to the input because the user's typing into it. And so you want to update the value of the input right away. That's an example of an urgent or a high priority update. But like you said, if you click stock 1 and you start loading it, but then the user says, oh, wait, no, I want to go to stock 2, you should be able to discard everything that's happening to load stock 1 and the whole update that was being prepared. A good example of what you're talking about would be like a mail browser, like Apple Mail. And you have your list of emails, and you click the first one, and it needs to load it and show it. And then you click the second one, and like you said, if you click the second one and you didn't have transitions, you'd have to just replace it with a loading spinner right away. Or you do some funky thing where, you fetch the data on the link, and then it's just some weird thing. What you want to be able to do is say, render, again, the command R thing, render my app as if I'm on /messages/2, but do that all in a transition. Do it as a low priority update. And that is what lets React start to prepare that screen for the second email in the background. But if you click email 3 before it's ready, we can just discard that and start loading email 3. And again, like you said, you could show a little spinner right next to the selected message because you have access to the transition state. So transitions are super awesome, super powerful. And you don't have to know too much about them to start benefiting from actions, client actions, like we just spent a long time talking about. But they are extremely powerful and they enable better composition patterns because think about your drop-down example. If I was using a drop-down from Radix and I select something, well, if the selection needs to do something async, now I'm on my own. And all of these libraries, calendars and date pickers, React has a notion of loading with Suspense. But if I click something and I want to just run an async function, again, open up any of your SPAs, you have a lot of async functions in there. None of these these ecosystem components from third-party packages can know that your app is in this pending state, in this submitting state. But now they can. It's in a state of transition. Because if Radix dropdown accepted an onSelect event, which just fires and forgets, but they also accepted a select action or a select action, you can pass in an async function. And now Radix, because of transitions, is going to know that your app is in a submitting state. They can do optimistic UI inside of it. They can use the pending state to show that your app is, maybe keep the menu open while something's loading. So, this is something that Andrew touched on in his keynote as well, but actions and then more generally transitions being a way for your app code to communicate with library components or components that you share around your company that things are happening is going to be, I think it's going to be really powerful, and it's going to enable a lot of cool stuff.
The visual of, just going back to something you said earlier, the visual of an event being something that just fires out once and that's it. There's no knowledge. It's like fire and forget. It fires and it doesn't care what you do with it. It doesn't even know what you do with it. And then an action being this thing like, okay, I'd like you to run this action and I'm going to know when you're done. You can just get this visual of how much cleaner that is. Like, which would you rather have in a big app, right? And
Exactly.
You get it's a really nice visual.
It's really cool. Maybe we'll wrap up with just I'm just going to quickly talk about this component I was working on this week, and it was a sortable list, and I built it with Framer Motion. Framer Motion has like a reorder component. It's a reorder.group and a reorder.item, and it works with local React state. So you have some state that you create. It's an array of items, and then for each item, you iterate over them and render a reorder.item. And then what it does is it lets you just drag them up and down. And every time you drag one past the other, you get an onReorder event, basically, that you use to set the state to the new order. And if you do that, you have this nice sortable list. I was doing this for a little to-do demo that I was making using React 19. an SPA. And what did I want to do? Well, I wanted to actually save the order in the backend, right? It doesn't do me any good if I just am synchronously updating React state. Eventually, I need to persist it. So what I was able to do is pretty awesome. I wrapped the framer motion reorder group into a component called a SortableList. And SortableList takes in a list of items, and it takes in an action that's called sort action. And sort action sends out the new sort order. And I actually made it so that it only happens when you drop, right? So you have 5 to-dos, you drag the first one down, and then you let go. At that point, you let go, the component calls sort action. And I pass in a function that makes an API request to update with the new sort order. But that's an async function I pass in. So my sortable list knows that it's an appending state, and it can use Optimistic to keep the order preserved. But when the fetch request comes back and the props are refreshed, it feeds back in. All of the optimistic state is discarded. Sortable list renders from the new props, and it's all thrown away. So if the sort fails, I've kept it optimistic, but it actually animates back. And so it always reverts. And it's an amazing example of the kind of composition that actions enable. It's really, really cool.
Also, it is beautiful. It is beautiful, but it is a great example of who knows more. And it's not just the client and the server. There's your app code that you're writing. Then there's this sortable list component that's like this library component that you've also written, but let's just say that's like the second piece. And then there's this third piece, which is a server. That sortable list can say, because it was given an action, can know that the action is running and can say, listen, any data you pass into me, I'm just going to ignore right now because you just resorted. I know you resorted, and I know you did something with that resort. You fired off an action. So I know the sort list right now. I know it better than you, and I know it better than the server. And then once the server responds, once all the actions are done, once the app settles, sortable list can instantly flip back and say, okay, you know more than me now. You definitely know more than me.
You couldn't do this in a library component before because you would end up making some crazy state machine, but the interface, the caller, the person using sortable list would have to tell it somehow. You're kind of flipping
I'm
it
done, right?
Yes, you're kind of flipping it between controlled and uncontrolled, right? It's controlled if my app is settled. And you can also do that. This is so cool because it took me a while to figure this out, but you make it controlled, you pass in your to-dos, but I could even add something from the caller side that just reverses it and it updates the props, but it does it synchronously. And because the app is settled, those things just animate and they flip. Because when the app is settled, like you said, it's a fully controlled sortable list. But if I've kicked off an action, it's uncontrolled. It's using its internal state as the source of truth. And it's pretty amazing that you can flip that with just an async function passed to an action prop.
Controlled versus uncontrolled might be a better way, or like a more formal way, more concrete way of saying who knows more. I think maybe we should start saying that. I really like that.
It's good. But and I think so. Really understanding controlled and uncontrolled is going to be important for React 19. It already is important for React. I think it's going to be more important as people can take advantage of these new composition patterns for them to make sure that they understand the difference. There's a great document in the React guides about sometimes like you get into sticky situations if you try to make a component kind of like sometimes controlled and sometimes not controlled. We've run into this.
Perfect example. You have like a set state that takes some initial state, and then you try to reset it somehow, and you end up like using effects or just something weird. But that's always a sign that you are in this state.
Always a sign. If you have any effects that are just setting state, you're basically doing something like, remember, get derived state from props. It's that same idea where within the component, you're kind of you're having to think about, so it's a cache, right? It's state that needs to be synchronized with something. And again, if you think about this transition thing, it's all about coordinating the local stateful app with something else that's somewhere else. And now that you know your app is in a state of transition, you can just go to town and then discard it. So there's lots of components, for example, in Radix, where when you start using them, you can use them as controlled or uncontrolled components, right? And if you have like a select list, you can render like, a select list, and then you select it, and then it just controls it. And so it knows which option is selected. And maybe it renders it out to like a form input field, so you can just submit that. But you don't need to control it with state, because it's all being controlled. So that's an uncontrolled component. It's managing its own internal state. But then when you want to control it, you can pass in a value and an on change. But it gets more complicated, because these components have parts of the state that you want them to keep controlling, even if you take it over. For example, maybe in a dropdown that lets you select an item, I want to control the selected value and what happens when you on-select. And maybe there's a select action, just like my sortable list, that lets me do something. But there's an active state too, where I use my arrow keys to choose the active item. And I don't want to control that. That can stay controlled by the component, managed by the component, but I can opt into controlling the selected item, right? And so I think this pattern is really powerful. And I think what we're going to see is ecosystem components basically do the same thing, but if they accept action props, a calendar select action, a drop down select action, a sortable list sort action, then they can basically do their own version of what the component should look like while they know more, while it goes into a state of being uncontrolled almost. And then it falls back to being controlled once the props refresh. And again, it's the same idea that's carried through React, which is like, how can we eliminate state, no long-lived cache, where you're trying to synchronize these two things to agree, just have a single source of truth. That's what it's all about. And it's really cool.
Dude, that's super, super interesting. So controlled versus uncontrolled has always been kind of static, right? Like if I have a value and an on change, then it's controlled. If I have default value, then it's uncontrolled. Like it doesn't change. It's static for the app. But you're saying with actions, you see a world where it is controlled when the app is settled, but then it becomes uncontrolled while the app's in flight. Is that what you're?
Yes,
Yeah,
that's exactly
super.
That
That's
is
really
exactly,
interesting. That is really interesting.
And this goes back to our discussion about like the Apollo cache, which is something I wanted to say. Whether you're using the Apollo cache or TanStack router, TanStack query, React query, all of these have caches. And we've done consulting with folks, and it does become like a nightmare to manage. And it's not because those technologies, there's anything wrong with them. It's because you have to manage a cache, and it's hard to do so. And when you have a to-do list that has like adding new to-dos, deleting, and toggling, you're basically rewriting a ton of logic at like a global level for the query itself. Like the query cache in these libraries like Apollo and React Query are about the data. They're not tied to components. They're not discardable. Like if you need a render from your cache, it needs to agree. It's like a normalized set of data that reflects, it's a subset of your server side data, but it's normalized, and you end up writing a lot of logic, and it's hard to get right. I mean, it's not any fault of the libraries. It's just a hard problem to do. And the beautiful thing about useOptimistic, or what we just described with the components, is that the pending state, it's temporary, and you get to make local changes. Yeah. You get to make local change. You don't have to reason about everything that could happen, because you're just making it uncontrolled for like just a second, for a short period of time. You only have to set is like to true. You don't have to find the like in the store cache and set it to true, so everything re-renders. And then if you made an error in that, you're going to have UI that disagrees. You're doing it at the component level. It's local, and then it just gets thrown away. So it makes all of this kind of work a lot easier. And it's both of these things are just going against this idea of like, how can we reduce the amount of state in our app as much as possible? And if we need some temporary cache state, let's just do it locally and then throw it away once the app settles. So pretty cool stuff.
Really cool. Really, really cool. We talk about like README driven development. Like you start with a README that should help shape your APIs. I have to think more about it, but I think there's something here with like these forgiving programming models. They're just really good. Like we make mistakes and we make a lot of mistakes. And so, yeah, so a model that's forgiving is just, it's awesome. Even if I can write the perfect cache code, the perfect database syncing library, there's something really nice about the forgiving aspect of all this. So yeah,
it's extremely nice. I mean, if you were going to talk to somebody and you're pairing on how to make the like button optimistic on Twitter, what's the first thing they would want to do? Just like set, oh, what do you mean? Just set is like to true. It's a React component. We have state. Just set is like to true, right? That's so easy because I know you just clicked like, so just set it to true. But what happens if like liked from server comes back in? Oh, we need an effect.
Yep.
Let's see if liked from server has changed. If it does, then set is liked to that value. Okay, but then like it again. But what happens if it re-renders before I know if the server prop? All of that stuff is about the fact that you have like basically get derived state from props, but then you change it. You're like controlling it, but it's like there's two sources of truth in that situation. And now the beauty of transitions being able to happen in the background and giving you a period, a state of your app that's in transition that lets you make optimistic updates is that for the duration of the transition, the source of truth is only the optimistic state. And then once it goes away, the source of truth is only the props again. And so just by the design, it forces you into one or the other, and you don't have anything to manage yourself. So pretty
really
awesome
nice
stuff.
Nice.
So that's not even everything in React 19, but I do think that's going to be the kind of stuff. If you're working on a React SPA right now, you're using React Router, you have a Create React app. You're just making new SPAs at your app that are at your company that are talking to APIs you already have. And all you've been hearing about from React 19 is about server components and server actions. And you see a lot of talk about Remix and Next, which are great frameworks, but they are like server first. And you don't think about doing this because you don't run node servers. You don't want to run a node server just to get a new React app up. Hopefully you heard some stuff that gets you excited, because I think, the composition patterns that are going to come, the benefits that app developers would get today from using actions, useActionState, and useOptimistic are huge. And so that was kind of what we wanted to talk about today.
Yeah. And if you work on one of these apps, if you work on like a pure SPA React app, we'd love to hear from you. We're toying with the idea of building more material around this. So if you could just like comment what your app is, what kind of tool you're building, what kind of app you're building. Because we'd love to get like just more of a feel of what our listeners are using to build their
day-to-day apps. Yeah, absolutely. You
Exactly.
can comment on our YouTube video or on Twitter at FrontEndFirstFM. But it's just I think this conversation came from hearing about folks. Seeing folks on Twitter, on Reddit, saying things like they're not interested in React 19 because
React 19
they don't
isn't
care
for them,
exactly.
which we feel like couldn't be further from the truth, but
right.
Yeah.
But trying to understand this perspective. So if you are working on SPA, let us know about it. Even maybe we could jump on a call and just like hear about the work and what problems you have and everything, because we're just trying to get a sense of the current landscape of SPAs in React. So should we wrap it up there?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, I guess that's it for this week. And again, hit us up at FrontEndFirstFM on Twitter if you have anything to share or any questions or any topics you'd like to hear us discuss in the future. Otherwise, 4th of July tomorrow, so should be fun here in the US. But that's it for this week, and we'll see you next week.
Cool. See ya.
Bye.